All right, so again, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. We are going to be discussing using investigative reporting tools to tell LGBTQ plus stories or stories about the queer communities. Again, we have two fabulous, incredible reporters. I'm really excited to join us. We have Kae Petrin, who's a data and graphics reporter at Chalkbeat, and Lucas Waldron, who is a visual journalist at ProPublica. So I'm just going to let you two take it away. If you could just introduce yourselves and give us a little bit of background on your experience covering LGBT issues. Why don't you start with you, Lucas?
Oh, sure. I will go first. Yeah, so I'm Lucas. I work at ProPublica. I'm on, as Adam said, I'm on more on a visual side of things most of the time, but I've also done a fair amount of reporting on LGBTQIA communities. There are two stories that I think are really relevant to this particular conversation that I've worked on. So I'll just give like a very maybe brief overview of those. Is this the right time to do that,
Yeah,
Adam?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay,
perfect.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm openly trans, and I'm very interested in reporting on trans communities and issues that are kind of unique to trans communities, or at least particularly important to trans communities. So one of the stories I've worked on that involved quite a bit of public records and sort of other investigative reporting tools came out a couple of years ago, and it was focused on how trans folks and non-binary folks experience TSA checkpoints. So those scanners that we all go through when we're going into the airport. There's been a decent amount of stories lately about this issue, but we did kind of a deep dive into the topic a few years ago, focused on how scanners essentially force trans people to have very invasive searches, sometimes even what most folks would probably consider a strip search of their bodies, basically because they don't conform to what the scanners are programmed to perceive as like a normal male or a normal female person. And so that story involved requesting records from the TSA specific to their complaint process. We requested a lot of records. We requested many years worth of records of all the complaints that the TSA had received and how those complaints were categorized. And I'm hoping at some point in this panel, we can get into talking about when you try to request records that don't exist. In many cases with trans communities, they are not represented at all in records or undercounted in records because of all sorts of categorization issues. And this was a story that really brought out that problem where there are lots of reasons why trans folks don't report invasive searches to the TSA through their normal sort of reporting process. And those range from the fact that the reporting process is horribly and deeply flawed, and like lots of other things that we can get into. So that's one story I worked on. Another story I worked on a few years ago is related to an investigation into how police departments investigate murders of trans people, whether or not police departments do, whether they use the correct name to describe people as they investigate. And that also involves a good amount of public records requests. So I'm excited to talk about both stories and answer other questions. Yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Lucas. How about you now, Kae?
Hi, I'm Kae. I'm a data graphics reporter at Chalkbeat. And I have reported across quite a few LGBTQ issues, specifically in Missouri while I was working for St. Louis Public Radio. A lot of my work there was specifically in dealing with courts records, some coverage of particularly non-discrimination laws in Missouri, and a few ongoing court cases that were happening there, as well as some work in prisons and specifically covering transgender prisoners and how they were treated in downstate Illinois. Not well. And so both of those sort of series of stories involve quite a bit of public records work, as well as thinking about sort of data and law in, I would say, non-traditional ways, thinking of ways to essentially create data sets and sort of explain issues at a broader scale when there isn't great tracking that already exists, especially dealing with sort of the patchwork of civil rights protections in Missouri, where we don't have statewide protections for trans people. And then I am currently at Chalkbeat working on several data-driven stories about trans and non-binary students and how they are tracked and what that sort of data means for students and legislation, etc. So those are not published yet, but they're in the works. So
oh my gosh, excited to see those.
Yeah, I'm very excited about the work I'm doing there.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I think broad stroke for me, I think similar to Lucas, dealing with a lot of issues of the data just not existing and thinking about, how do we, if the public records or the data doesn't exist, how do we make that part of the story and think about what investigative work is in sort of a non-traditional manner.
Yeah, totally. So since both of you kind of hit that, why don't we just jump into that point? The US government is just now starting to capture data about queer people. The US Trans Survey is just now starting work after a significant pause. So because data is, why don't we just kind of talk about like the limitations in finding qualitative, like long-term data about queer and trans people and like how that can kind of create roadblocks, like surmountable roadblocks nonetheless, but roadblocks and nonetheless in our reporting. Why don't you start, Kae?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing that you run into a lot with trying to do any data-driven story is often the first step is, well, okay, what data exists already, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're looking for data on LGBTQ people broadly, and especially trans people, the answer is often basically none.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few reliable survey sources that are done at regular intervals, but the sample sizes are often very small, and the questions are not really usable for sort of really for really in-depth reporting. There are a couple ways that you can find data that sort of is about LGBTQ people, but it's never labeled as, you don't just see like a demographic data set that contains LGBTQ people generally. So you often have to think about, read between the lines of what the data is and how it's collected to identify the ways that LGBTQ people might be represented in it, and then take sort of extra reporting steps to contextualize that and the limitations of it. Because the data just, in many cases, like has not been collected or has been collected very badly. So, yeah.
Yeah, how about you, Lucas? Obviously, like you said, this came up a lot in your reporting on the TSA scanners.
Yeah, totally. I think everything Kae said makes a lot of sense. It's very difficult to find good data. And one of the things we found when we were looking at this story about TSA scanners and how folks who are trans or non-binary deal with them is looking at the complaint data. This seemed like maybe one way to find out how big of a problem this issue was. I know anecdotally, I knew that lots of trans folks I know and myself had issues with TSA scanners and being, questioned or detained related to sort of an anomaly in the scanning, but there wasn't any big picture data other than just knowing, word of mouth, oh, I know people. So what we first did was request all of the complaints that had been filed to the TSA. I think this was over maybe a 5-year period. And we requested them to be categorized by complaint type, which in theory could have been really helpful. And, we did get that data back. But what we quickly found was that there were 2 different categories. One was just called transgender and one was called gender. And these 2 categories were not defined. So we quickly realized that a complaint that came in from someone related to gender identity broadly could be filed into either one of these categories, or it could be filed into both. And so we had an issue of not knowing, how internally the staff within the Department of Homeland Security were supposed to be filing complaints and tagging them, and then not knowing if we were getting any double counting, and so that posed a big issue. We ended up sort of working through it and taking sort of the lowest. We kind of took the most generous approach in saying, well, of just the complaints labeled transgender specific, not even considering the complaints labeled gender, which surely there were some in the, surely some of those complaints were part of the issue we were talking about. But we ended up looking at just the complaints labeled transgender and found that there was still some data significance to just that number, which was, I think, about 5% of the complaints were like filed under that tag. And by most estimations of the adult population of the US, like it's probably less than 5% identify as transgender or non-binary, which made us believe that there was a clear, clearly this was a problem across the population that did not just reflect sort of the average amount of people who are trans. And so that kind of was a helpful point as we were looking into this. And just like one other point on that, talking about this other story I mentioned when we were trying to track how police departments investigate murders of transgender people, we filed public records requests for all of the investigative files related to each of these killings over a course of just a couple of years. And doing that work was also a little bit difficult because in many cases the files were like using names that these folks don't identify with, considered the term dead name, which hopefully folks on this chat are familiar with, but essentially using someone's name that they no longer use or are associated with. So that was a whole data issue also, was just trying to figure out like how many of these people were even being counted by the police departments themselves as trans or queer. And it turned out in almost none of the cases were they being counted correctly.
Great, thank you so much for all of that. So I guess kind of just stepping back to what I'll say are like the first stages, I think, of like an investigative story. How do you kind of hone in on I guess like a story about LGBTQ plus people, and how I guess do you then advocate for that story as like a worthwhile investigative project? Why don't we start with you this time, Lucas?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I generally come up with the stories that I have ended up working on have come to me generally through either an experience that I had or awareness of the community, which is part of the reason why I think it's like so important to have queer and trans reporters in your newsroom, because many times you just won't know what the stories are if you don't have people in those communities represented, just like any other community that is underrepresented. So that's a big piece of it. I think with the TSA story, I was anecdotally aware just from my own experience, but I did receive a tip from someone who reached out to ProPublica to say they had had a particularly awful and invasive search by the TSA, and had this person had really done their due diligence in documenting the situation. And so for me, I was able to go to editors and say, I know this is a problem personally, but then I also have this like potential source who could be a really big piece of the story, who's willing to talk, and she wants to, share the records that she has. And so it's a bit of a mix, but I think that personal experience angle is sometimes missing in newsrooms that don't employ enough trans folks.
Yeah, definitely. Amen to trans reporters telling trans stories. So again, now UK, thank you.
Yeah, and a lot of the work that I have done has often come from sort of stepping back from the news cycle a bit and sort of thinking, okay, so there is a breaking issue, or, in Missouri, a lot of times it's a bill that's been proposed that's pretty alarming. And you often can, you can stop at the story about the bill, right? But if you step back and sort of ask, okay, what information is already out here? If there's something happening in the legislature, there is probably a underlying problem, data that exists one example is that Missouri, there's been some bills to decriminalize prosecution for HIV/AIDS transmission, which is still very illegal in Missouri and is a law that is framed in such a way that the prosecution is very discriminatory. And so when, and that's actually a story that I think that though we investigated it, that was an instance where, making the pitch to editors did not make it through. But in order to sort of like find the data, start looking for the story, start putting a pitch together and figure out how to tell this story, we were looking in between existing criminal prosecution data sets. So we got like the list of people who had been prosecuted under a specific set of laws and said, okay, how big is this group? Who's in the group? There was a really big racial disparity in who was in the group. And just looking at sort of, okay, there's court records that we know we can grab, so we can find individual people from this sort of vague data set that doesn't have anything in and of itself about LGBTQ people, but we know this law is, sort of tied in. And so you can sort of, in a lot of ways, like follow the breadcrumbs by stepping back from that initial piece of legislature to see what's happening behind the scenes. And then, pitching the urgency, the scale, and the importance of it becomes a matter of, trying to crunch those numbers and find a really core person to that source, that Lucas is talking about often can be really key to convincing editors.
Yeah, definitely. And so both of you are obviously incredibly talented, skilled journalists, but like what was, when we first started covering like LGBTQ plus issues, what are some things that like kind of helped you be successful early on? And like, build not only a portfolio of work, but like, I guess, confidence as a queer reporter covering queer issues? Lucas, let's start with you.
Well, that's a great question. I don't know. I still am always looking for that confidence. But I think when I started at ProPublica, it was never part of my job description to do reporting on these communities, but it just was an interest area. So I got really lucky that someone I worked with at ProPublica, who's actually now my editor, was super interested and sympathetic and excited about reporting on the queer community largely, and like really encouraged me to go out and do some of the reporting, even though I was a pretty green reporter. And so that was a huge had a huge impact on me. And so I think the takeaway from that experience was like, who your editor is matters so much, and whether the people in your newsroom who are higher up and have the power to assign stories, whether they are willing to invest in the work and help you is, it's such an important part of management. And, it's certainly a lucky situation that I found myself in. I didn't come to ProPublica with a huge amount of LGBTQ reporting behind me. So it was more luck than anything else, to be honest.
How about you, Kae?
Yeah, I think really seconding, like finding allies in the newsroom who already see the value in the coverage, who can help you sort of make the case for those pitches. That's something that I found really valuable and was sort of like, the make or break in a lot of cases is, was there somebody who sort of is going to look at a story and be like, yeah, how can we shape this up? Like, how can we make this case to the editors, whoever's making those calls? And ideally, your editor is also somebody who's going to see and support that. But like, if not everyone is that, lucky enough to be in that position. And so finding the other people who can help, work with the person who is making those calls to make the argument for the story can be really useful. Also, just in general, I think when I started first covering LGBTQ issues, it was, I think picking issues that the newsroom was already interested in. I started, my first stories were sort of on homelessness and trans homeless shelters not with really bad policies about admitting trans folks in St. Louis, and like it was not particularly investigative. It was sort of, you know, calling up a few homeless shelters and asking them what their policies were. But it was, you know, a small scale story, and starting with that initial small scale accessible coverage sort of built the case for me to work with editors to get more time and invest more in in-depth stories that did require, you know, budgets for FOIAs and going to out of the way court dates and things like that. So.
Okay, kind of on that subject, Kae, what are some strategies, I guess, for like advocating for these stories when your newsrooms like maybe haven't done a ton of this type of reporting before, as frankly, like a lot of mainstream media hasn't?
Yeah, I think something that I found really like the thing that tended to convince people was having that, you know, core source from the start. So I think often if you don't have that source, then editors who are less familiar with LGBTQ issues might get a really specific idea of who you need to talk to. That's not necessarily going to be a good fit for the story, and sort of be an extractive approach to identifying sources. So really finding, you know, that person who can speak to the core issue as a starting point can be very valuable. And like often with LGBTQ stories, since the data is not good, you don't have that really like hammer and nail, oh, there's, you know, the rate of discrimination is 3 times higher, that really gets editors to buy into something. But finding things that are sort of that are really still sort of illustrative, even though you can't, you know, large scale find tons of data to make a sweeping statement, can often be a way into it to like invest the time to start finding that data and getting a more tangible, conclusive argument. So starting with sort of those smaller pieces and building up. I think if you can find compelling small pieces, that can really be the place to start.
Yeah, that's such a really good point. How about you, Lucas? How do you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I think that one of the struggles as queer reporters is when you're pitching a story, you're often having to start at a level of explaining what queer identity is to the editors. So you're often having to sort of take these big step backs and say, like, this is what a trans person is, like this is what a non-binary person is. And hopefully, like, as time passes, our editors across this whole industry will start understanding those things much better and coming in with like much more competency. But I do think that, you know, one of the strategies I've had to take is like trying to take a step back and like articulating first, like there's this group of people that you may not be familiar with, but that, you know, has these like very specific problems that are, you know, right in line with what ProPublica reports on. And, you know, our focus is very much on public interest-based investigative reporting, and, you know, exposing abuses of power. And so I've generally thought of it as taking a bigger step back than just pitching the story, but more like pitching the community. And then saying, and, you know, this community is marginalized for all these reasons, and here's this really specific piece of that marginalization that we actually could do a story on, and it could actually like make a difference on. So I think that's one piece of it. I think what Kae said too about having to kind of accept that the data isn't always there, and it's a lot easier to sell editors on stories when you could point to that data set that says, you know, oh, this community is discriminated against at a X times more rate than, you know, than average. And so one of the strategies that, and I luckily at ProPublica, we have a really amazing engagement team who love to work on stories that are focused on like hard to reach communities. And so one of the strategies I've had is sort of cultivating relationships with our engagement team and going to them. And in the case of the TSA story, I mentioned like going and saying, you know, we don't have data, but like, could we do a call out to get as many people to talk to us as possible? And they've been really great about saying, yeah, like we could totally put out a call out and we could try to push that out and get people to come to us. And it's not really data in the way that we would normally define data in the industry, but it is data that it's a group of maybe 100 people who have a shared experience and are providing, specific answers to questions. And that's a great, I think, place to get to be able to sell editors on stories.
Yeah. And I think what you said there as well about sort of thinking about it in context of, well, maybe we don't necessarily do a lot of LGBTQ stories already, but how do we fit it into the larger mission? And really framing it in terms of, what's the work we're already doing and how do we extend that can be really powerful part of your sort of pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've kind of talked a lot about how like there isn't necessarily like government data about like at least like reliable government data, or if it's there, it's limited. Are there any other like places that you turn to, like either if you're like trying to bolster a pitch with some data, or like a public research agency that like you find helpful to include in your reporting when you're reporting on queer people? How about you, Kae?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of go-to sources. Like I'll go talk to nonprofits, and there's a couple existing surveys that I'm going to mangle all of the acronyms for now. But the big, HRC does a lot of stuff. The Transgender Law Center, and a lot of times they might have know of researchers who are looking into things. So a number of the stories that I have done have actually started with, somebody published a book about what was happening in a different state, and I wanted to go see, what's the data look like in Missouri. So making those connections from sort of nonprofits to researchers or think tanks that might be doing less publicized work, but that's already sort of done, that there's already methodology for out there, but that can be sort of shifted into an investigative journalism context if you make a few public records requests. So those sort of like, I think, experts who are already investing in the research to get, make some of these requests on their own and do studies and do surveys, that can be a good starting point for getting extra context.
Yeah, definitely. What are your, I guess, go-to resources, Lucas?
I think Kae kind of covered the stuff that I would say. I mean, there was the NCTE trans survey, which is now a number of years old, but did provide some really helpful context around how trans folks experience all different sorts of things: law enforcement interactions, I think access to education, access to housing. There's some base level stuff that you could draw from that. I want to say that was way back in like 2015, but I might be forgetting the year. Yeah, but it's like there is a new one, I think, in the works, so hopefully there'll be some new data to work with. I also think federal level data is really, really tough, but some states have better data. So, if you're reporting on, for example, prisons, I believe some states do have a little bit better track, like keep slightly better track of how many trans folks are in their prisons. And I think same thing with school districts, like some schools might have better data than others. So once you get to that like regional level, you can start maybe getting slightly more reliable data, and with obviously a smaller sample size. So that's kind of where I would, that's where I would start. Unfortunately, many of my stories are federal level data, which is very tough. So that's where you might not have much to work with.
Yeah, totally. Just speaking personally, the resources that have kind of come up the most in my own reporting are like the Gallup and the Pew research data sets, as well as the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Waldron. Really cool. I just used
I've also used Williamson.
Yeah, no, they're great. I use them for like a story I recently did with the Appeal on the gay and trans panic events, because they pulled together like a list of like a bunch of like, they did like essentially the clip search and everything already. So yeah,
that's great. Yeah,
it's great. I love them. So we have time for a Q&A. I'm just gonna have one more question just from me, and this one is, I think, probably the most important question. And that, when we investigate LGBTQ plus issues, we're often talking about the worst moments of a person's life. Discrimination, violence, trauma, whether it's like sexual violence, outright murder, things like that. And what is your advice to journalists who want to cover these issues like sensitively and with recognition to the dangers that face our sources, not only like before we talk, but that can also come after their experiences are publicized in a prominent news organization. Lucas, if you want to start off with that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's always really scary going into publication when you have sources who are, who could be compromised by the story itself. I wouldn't say that I have any perfect answer, but one of the strategies, I guess, that I've tried to think of is when I do work with sources, really focusing on consent. And often I've worked with, I wouldn't say often, but at times, the communities that I might be talking to, the individual people I might be talking to, might not be so familiar with what it means to talk on the record or to agree to like give their name and be published. So, and I think this is true not just with queer and trans folks, but with all communities who may not have as much access to like journalists or journalism to really explain what it means. Explain what it means when you say that you're a journalist, what it means when you say that you're asking them to go on the record. I try to take that, really do my due diligence and ensuring that they know what we're talking about. And then I also work with my editors to provide anonymity. We did that with the story, the TSA story that I keep talking about. The person who was kind of the lead of the story and one of the primary sources didn't want to be identifiable. And so we used her middle name and we photographed her in a way that wasn't showing her face. And I think it's really important to like have those conversations about consent and then leave the path open to allowing anonymity for sources where it is a situation that makes sense. Yeah,
Definitely.
Definitely.
How about you?
Definitely seconding everything Lucas said, especially with like, people don't necessarily realize if, their name is searched by an employer in 5 years, the story might show up. Really contextualizing some of that. I really like the resource. It's called Why Should I Tell You? A Guide to Less Extractive Reporting. It's not specific to reporting on LGBTQ people, but it's, I think a really good guide for talking to any marginalized source. And it has a really good sort of outline of, here's the things that people might not consider and here's how to talk through them. And I think also the point about, whether or not the source is able to, giving them a really good sense of potential consequences of, being named, and talk that part of the reporting process. I think just you have to be a lot more careful with it when you're talking to LGBTQ sources, and especially for sensitive and investigative issues.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially in the digital age that we live in, like even just like being in a story can open somebody up to a lot of like online harassment, that their personal information can get leaked. They can be bombarded with like transphobic and like violent threats that like put them at very serious personal risk. So I think like a lot of reporters might or definitely think about that nowadays, because I think we all face a little bit of like some bullshit on Twitter, quite frankly. But I think that's just an important part of the conversation, that like somebody's fear isn't just like, oh, I'm afraid that like my family and friends will see this. It's like I'm afraid that somebody's gonna like hate that I exist and like leak my name and my address, and like somebody's gonna come like try to burn my house down or something like that. Like these are like the things that, and especially it depends on where you live as well, especially if you're reporting in communities that are very unfriendly to trans people. I think that's especially important to take note of.
Yeah, when I was reporting on employment discrimination, the source we ended up leading with was somebody who just straight up doesn't like work in, like is now like full-time paid to do nonprofit work with trans people, because like everyone else we talked to was like, I am currently employed at a place that's discriminating against me, and I, there it's like as a journalist, the sort of ethics of dealing with that are like, cannot necessarily take all those editorial steps necessary to minimize the consequences if you decide to use your name in stories like this under those under that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so those are all of my questions. Now I just want to open up the Q&A. I see Marissa has already sent in a question. If you have any questions, please feel free to just share them in the chat below. So I will start with Marissa's. So news and journalism has historically harmed LGBTQ plus communities, along with many other marginalized communities. So what steps or recommendations do you have to build trust and minimize harm through your reporting? That's something I think that even us as trans journalists struggle with because of people's hesitance to talk to the media. Obviously, we've talked about the importance of having trans journalists tell trans stories, but there are only so many of us, and not all of us want to be covering discrimination and things like that, that specifically centers on our community. So yeah, I guess that was a long-winded way to ask. How do you help build trust and minimize harm among your sources? Kae, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the sort of what we've been discussing is really relevant here. Like part of the process of making sure someone understands what everything entails, like that's also part of a trust building process. Mm-hmm. And I think also being really clear about what like I as a reporter can and can't control about what might ultimately be published, right? Sometimes if you work for a publication where you have zero control over the headline, like that's something that I make sure a source understands. And I've definitely been in situations where I've gone back and talked to a source about sort of editorial conversations that were happening. Like anything, you're not going to send somebody, the whole story or a preview, anything like that. But I think treating it like any sort of fact checking endeavor, but also keeping in mind, like there's a person on the other end of this who does have a lot of reasons to be cautious and deserves, some extra steps of context and care. And so I think just trying to be attentive, like pretty much from the moment of reaching out to someone initially all the way through the, end in publication of the story. And I've tried to stay in touch with sources afterwards as well, depending on the story and subject matter.
Yeah, definitely. How about you, Lucas?
Yeah, I think one of the really lucky things about working in investigative reporting is the time that you get to develop a story. So that's been really great because in every situation I have spent time with the sources in the stories. So, having in-person, conversations and time spent, I think is so critical for building trust. It's obviously not always possible, particularly during a pandemic, but if you are a local reporter who is in the community with folks or are able to travel and spend time, that's always been probably the biggest step in terms of like building trust and reaching people. For me, I think I'm thinking back to one particular experience where I knew that I wanted to really focus on a series of police investigations in Jacksonville, Florida, looking at several murders of trans women there. And the community that I was focused on are folks who were, didn't necessarily have regular access to internets or to the internet or phones, and weren't necessarily like, people who you could just like call up and confirm information. And it was really important to just like go there and talk to people and learn where they hang out and spend the time with them. And I think that made the story wouldn't have been possible without going and spending the time with them. So when you can, and to the extent that it's safe, pandemic wise, doing that work is important. I'd also say checking back in with sources, particularly if you're working on a story for a long time, checking back in with them on, hey, just want to confirm, the pronoun that I'm using in the story. Like, is this still right? I just want to check my notes. Is this still right? Just kind of doing the check-ins and phrasing it as, am I getting this correctly? Giving people time to adjust if they say, well, actually, that's not quite how I want to be referred to. I think those are always really important conversations to have after you've had, developed the relationship.
Yeah, definitely. And this is actually a question I meant to get to earlier, but how do you, as reporters, make sure that the like stories about LGBTQ plus people that you're telling kind of challenge or push the narrative, and is different than like, you know, I guess the misconceptions are just like the stories that are covered in everyday mainstream media. Let's start with you, Kae.
I feel like that's a big question, right? Because
Right.
to some degree, I think coming from the starting place of being a queer person reporting on these stories does a lot of that initial work, because many of, you know, a lot of the bad coverage is coming from straight people who don't know anything about LGBT communities. But also thinking about, like, I don't know, in my case, what sorts of stories I'm pitching in the first place. Because like you could sort of follow a lot of the coverage that's already being done and try to do, you know, a version of it that's better. But there's so little, you know, time and energy in newsrooms across the nation dedicated to LGBTQ stories that often, like, just finding different stories as a starting place, I think can be really, really, like the way that I prefer to go to some degree, because there can be, you know, this is the one story, this is the one narrative, and we're just going to, you know, continue following this. But like, oh, you know, look over here, no one's looking over here, you know, I think can be to some degree more important to changing the narrative than trying to be, you know, one story in 200 stories and like 100 of them are awful, you know. So that's just my way of looking at it, but I think there's a lot of other ways to do that too. So
right, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I think like just starting off like, okay, we're like trans and queer reporters, so like we fundamentally know that, like, you know, I think the article that sticks out in my mind, there was that one New York Times article from like, I think hopefully years ago about the chest binders that like, are they terrible? And it was like, okay, so like we know they're not terrible. So like anyway, we're not going to focus on that. Or like, you know, the story, right? And it's like, here's how it helps people. Here's how it like prevents like teens and children from like killing themselves. Like things like that. Like, you know, you come at it from like a different perspective that like I think frankly like is a little more humanizing a lot of the time, and not just like, oh, look at these, like, again, I think it comes down to like, oh, it's not like the journalism that's like, oh, look at these weird people and look at the things that they're doing. Like, you know, I feel like that's kind of how I feel sometimes when I see reporting on like trans and queer people. And that's why I love that the Trans Journalists Association exists, and that like IRE like put out its LGBTQ plus issue, and that like it feels like there is finally some more credence given to work by queer journalists for queer journalists. Yeah. So Lucas, what about you? What are some ways that I guess you try to make up for some of the problems you see in mainstream media, or just like challenge some misconceptions that you see out there in your reporting?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I don't necessarily feel like I approach my work by like trying to make up for anything in particular. Like it just trying to like do the reporting that I care about. So I think that so much of the reporting on trans folks, particularly, you know, the sort of breathless coverage of whether it be so the, you know, various like sports bans and the sort of state level discrimination are, you know, do a very poor job of interviewing actual trans people or talking to actual trans people. And so, you know, it's a really basic part of journalism that like so many journalists seem to totally not be able to do, which is like talk to the subjects of your stories. And so, you know, I wouldn't even say that it's like something that goes into my stories as like an intentional thought, because it's like, obviously, of course, we're going to talk to the trans people, but like, you know, I just think for folks who are not trans or not queer, who might engage with like this particular conversation, you know, it's like just making sure that your sources are in fact, those people. I think that I may remember this incorrectly, but like the New York Times story referenced Adam. I feel like that they didn't even talk to any like trans people in that story, and I think that was part of the reason it was so like outraging. So that's, to me, I guess the very, very starting point for any story.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's unfortunate that like just talking to a trans person when reporting on trans issues is like somehow novel. So I think that's if that's the starting point, then like we're doing what we can. Okay.
Yeah. There's also like, I think also having LGBTQ reporting positions is something that's very, very rare. The only publication I can think of that I know for sure has like multiple LGBTQ reporters is the 19th. And I may be missing others, but like, to have that be a beat is pretty rare, and I think is an important thing to have in newsrooms. Though I think you could also argue that any story could be an LGBTQ related story. So there's kind of two sides to that, but still having the focus, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I will agree with all of that. So we were actually right at time. We just have a couple minutes left as I look at watch that I don't have. And so I just wanted to thank you both so much for joining me on this panel. It's obviously something that I care deeply about, and it was really just so exciting to be able to talk with you both about this. If anybody needs any or has any questions about this, do you mind if you share your Twitter handle in the chat?
Oh, sure.
Just like for the sake of like following up with any questions that they may have. Additionally, if anybody wants to look at if anybody needs some more resources about reporting on LGBTQ+ issues, the Investigative Reporters and Editors Association just put out a big issue reporting on LGBTQ+ issues. I think, Kae, you are in that, correct? Fabulous. And that guide has a link to a bunch of different resources for LGBTQ+ journalism, including the Trans Journalists Association that Kae helped found in 2020. So I think to wrap up this panel, I just want to say that investigative reporting on LGBTQ+ issues is something that every news organization should be doing, every news organization should be devoting resources to, and just hire more trans journalists to tell these stories too. So thank you both so much for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. Bye, friends.
Bye-bye.